Michael had me start with the crank. The handle was waist-high and cold under my hands, even with the August sun coming through the open doors of the crank house. The machinery took some pressure at first, then shifted with a long metal groan. Gears turned behind the housing. Somewhere outside, water moved against the stone. "Slow," Michael said. "You force it, you're going to bend something." "I'm not forcing it. You're thinking about it." He stood beside me with one hand on the railing and the other wrapped around his oxygen tube. He was a small, thin man in worn work pants and a canvas jacket that had faded almost gray. His hands shook when he reached for the crank. The nails were yellow and thick, and the skin around them looked stretched tight over the bones. He took the handle from me and turned it another half rotation. His fingers slipped off. Michael caught himself against the railing. "You all right? Keep turning." He said it like I hadn't even asked. Then he coughed into his fist. It was a wet cough. When it stopped, he stood there breathing through his nose until he could speak again. "Gates chained to the shaft. Runs down through the wall. Nothing to it. You grease these points every morning, or if the handle starts to drag." He pointed them out. 2 fittings on the main housing, one lower down near the floor, and another behind a section of guard plate that had to be removed with a wrench. I knew machinery. I'd spent 15 years working on furnaces and rooftop units, most of them in places where the owners had waited too long to call somebody. A locked gate wasn't that different from anything else. Metal moved or it didn't. If it didn't, you found out why. Michael walked me along the crank house and showed me the water gauges. They were mounted in pairs, one for the upstream side and one for the chamber. The glass on the lower gauge was cloudy. A red line had been painted across the face, though the paint had run in one place and dried in a drip. "Read them before you open anything," he said. "The state wants a lot of records. The state wants proof somebody was here." That was probably true. We went outside to the chamber. The lock sat in a straight cut through the old canal, its stone walls dark with damp even where the sun reached them. The water was low. A few weeds had grown in the cracks along the far bank, and the towpath ran past the other side under a line of trees. Michael showed me the handwheel for the drain valves, then the latch on the downstream gate. He explained which way the water would move and what to watch for if a gate caught. He explained it twice, mostly because he kept stopping to cough. There wasn't much traffic on the Corliss Canal anymore. A boat could go by some afternoons, he said, but not often. Most of the job was checking levels, keeping the machinery from rusting solid, and staying available if somebody called. It sounded dull. Dull was fine with me. The tender's house sat a short walk from the crank house. It was a low white place with a screened porch and a roof that had been patched in at least 3 shades of gray. The inside smelled like old wood and dust. There was a kitchen, 1 bedroom, a bathroom with a loose floor tile, and a small room where I could keep the state radio and the logbooks. The paperwork waited on the kitchen table. Michael set the folder in front of me and lowered himself into a chair. He took a while getting the oxygen tube settled behind his ears. I read through the forms while he watched the yard through the window. The position was on the pension track. The house came with it. So did a $40 nightly stipend for work outside the regular schedule. I signed where the state had marked the lines. The HVAC company had failed in the spring. Not all at once. First, the bigger jobs dried up. Then the suppliers wanted payment up front. Then the truck needed a transmission, and I didn't have the money for it. By the time the divorce was final, most of what I'd saved was gone. Molly's tuition had kept coming anyway. The house and the pension track made the job worth taking. The $40 helped too. Michael looked over the paperwork after I finished. "You'll get used to the place. It's a lock." "That's what I said. You said I'd get used to it." He looked at me then. His pale eyes were steady, even though the rest of him wasn't. Same thing. He signed the witness line and pushed the folder back across the table. Then he told me where the spare fuses were kept, which window stuck in damp weather, and how the radio worked. None of it was difficult. The radio had 3 channels and 1 switch that needed to be held down while talking. Michael took me back outside after that. His truck was parked beside the gravel lot. It was an old dark pickup with rust around the wheel wells and a state decal peeling off the driver's door. He put his keys in his hand, but didn't get in. "There's one thing they don't put in the manual," he said. I waited. He looked toward the downstream side of the lock. "Listen, if that downstream bell rings between 2 and 3 in the morning, you open the lock, fill the chamber, and cycle it through. While it drains, you keep your eyes on the far bank. Don't look at the water." I looked at him. "Why?" "Because that's the rule." "That's not an answer." He rubbed his thumb along the edge of the keys. His hand was shaking again. "The state pays an extra $40 for that?" "It pays because somebody has to do it, and it keeps paying as long as you follow the rule." I glanced back at the lock. From the parking area, I could see the top of the downstream gate and the bell mounted beside it. The bell was bigger than I expected. Its metal housing had been painted black at some point, though most of that had come off. "So what happens if I look?" Michael's mouth tightened. "Keep your eyes on the far bank." "Michael, don't look at the water." He said it twice. Then he took a breath that clicked somewhere in his chest and opened the truck door. I figured it was an old man's superstition attached to a harmless state stipend. Every place had something like that. Don't stand under the ladder. Don't touch the thermostat. Don't use the west elevator when it rains. People worked somewhere long enough and started making up reasons. Michael got behind the wheel. The engine coughed before it caught. He rolled the window down as he pulled away. "The count will reach 11 eventually," he called. "Never let it finish." I took a step toward the truck. "What count?" He kept driving. "Michael, what count?" The truck turned onto the towpath and raised a strip of dust behind it. He didn't stop. A few seconds later, the trees hid the truck, and then there was only the sound of the engine fading toward the road. I stood there with the keys to lock 9 in my pocket. The machinery was old. That was all. That evening, I made my first log entry at the desk in the tender's house. Water levels were normal. The radio worked. The weather was clear. No boat traffic. The downstream bell had a fresh strip of red paint on the clapper. It looked like somebody had painted around the old rust without bothering to clean it first. In the ledger, below the regular passage lines, there was a blank one marked off-schedule passage. I ran my finger over the page. Neglected procedure. That was what it looked like. I wrote the levels down and shut the ledger. The next week settled into a routine pretty quickly. I checked the gauges in the morning, greased the gears, and walked the length of the chamber before dark. The radio stayed quiet. No boats came through. The bell didn't move. After a while, I stopped looking at it every time I passed. There were other things to think about. The kitchen faucet dripped. The bedroom window wouldn't stay open unless I wedged a piece of cardboard under the frame. I had to call the state line twice about a light over the back steps that kept going out. The lock itself worked fine. On the 14th morning, I opened the ledger and found $40 credited to the off-schedule line. I checked the date. Then I checked the previous pages. No bell, no boat, no radio call. Nothing entered after my first log. I called the state payment line from the kitchen phone. The woman on the other end asked for my employee number and made me repeat it when I read one digit wrong. Then she put me on hold. The music was 3 notes repeated over and over. When she came back, she said the payment had been processed and there was no error on the account. So I get paid for something that didn't happen? That's what the record shows. She didn't sound interested in fixing it. I kept the money. It was the first payment I could send toward Molly's tuition. That made the decision easier. $40 wasn't enough to make me rich, but it was enough to cover a book or lab fee or some other thing that showed up after I'd already thought the month was handled. I wired half of the accumulated stipend to Molly's school account the following week. Then I called her. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad. Hey, you get the payment?" There was a pause. I could hear voices behind her and something mechanical humming. "I'm busy, Dad, but I got it. Thank you. It's not much. I know. I can send more when the next one comes through." "You don't have to. I'll send it." Another pause. She didn't ask about the job. I didn't mention the bell or Michael or the Count. She would have laughed at the whole thing, and I wasn't interested in hearing that. We didn't talk about the divorce either. "Okay," she said. "Okay. I've got to go." "Yeah." She ended the call. I left the phone on the table for a while after that. Then I put it back on the charger and went outside to check the gauges. Nothing changed for another few weeks. The canal stayed mostly empty. The radio stayed silent. I greased the gears and logged the water levels because that was what the job required. By then, Michael's warning had turned into one of those things I could repeat without taking seriously. 2 to 3 in the morning. Open the lock, fill the chamber. Keep your eyes on the far bank while it drained. The part about the far bank was the worst of it. Not because it was frightening, because it sounded ridiculous. 6 weeks after Michael handed over the job, I went down to the chamber in the middle of the afternoon. The sun was high and hot. Cicadas worked in the trees along the towpath. There wasn't any wind, and the water beyond the downstream gate barely moved. I leaned over the rail and looked down. The chamber was empty except for mud, weeds, and a rusted bicycle frame lying near the gate. One wheel was gone. The other had sunk halfway into the mud. That was what Michael wanted me to avoid looking at. An empty ditch and an old bicycle? I laughed, because the whole thing had finally gotten too stupid. Then I went back to the crank house, without incident. The next 14 days went the way the others had. I checked the gauges in the morning, greased the gears, and walked the chamber before dark. Nothing came through. The radio stayed quiet. I still looked at the bell when I passed it, but not for long. Then it was 2:11 in the morning, and the bell rang. It was one flat clang from the downstream side. No warning. No second ring. I woke up in the bedroom with my heart already going and listened for another sound. The house was quiet. August night pressed against the windows. The air was still and the curtains hung motionless. I got dressed and took the radio from the kitchen. The light over the back steps came on after the second try. I walked down to the crank house, raised the radio to my mouth, and called for a boat waiting below the lock. Static answered me. I tried again. Same thing. A low wash of noise with a faint crackle underneath it. Lock 9 to any vessel below the downstream gate. Come back. Nothing. Michael's rule had been clear enough. If the bell rang between 2 and 3, I opened the lock, filled the chamber, and cycled it through. So I put the radio on the rail and took hold of the crank. The handle turned hard at first. I worked it through the resistance and heard the upstream gate shift inside the wall. Water started running into the chamber. I kept turning until the gate was open. The water came in faster then, dark and cold under the weak light. I stood at the upstream rail and watched it spread across the bottom. The surface lifted a little at a time, carrying bits of weed and small pieces of bark toward the downstream end. A boat should have been waiting below. I looked past the gate toward the dark stretch of canal. No running lights, no lantern, nothing moving. I called again. The radio gave me static. "All right," I said. "I'll do it myself. I'll do it myself." I crossed to the downstream side and opened the drain valves. The first wheel squealed when I put my weight against it. The second one turned easier. Water rushed through the channels beneath the gate and made a deep, hollow sound in the stone. The level dropped. Then it stopped dropping. Not all the way. There was still water in the chamber, maybe a foot deep. But the valves were open, and the flow beneath them sounded steady. I walked back to check the wheels. Both were turned as far as they would go. The machinery wasn't jammed. The water just wasn't moving right. I leaned over the rail. The surface lay dark below me, barely shifting. There should have been a current running toward the drains. Instead, the water looked thick, like oil before it spreads. Something tapped against the inside of the downstream gate. I stood up. It tapped again, slow and even, from below the water line. I looked toward the gate. The tapping came once more. There wasn't any boat down there. Nothing could have reached the inside of the gate from the canal's side without making a sound, and the water outside was flat enough to show every light from the crank house. I checked the valves again. Then I checked the radio, though I knew what it would say. Static. The tapping continued. I put both hands on the rail. The metal was cold. The cold moved through my palms and into my wrists, then up my arms. I didn't know if that made sense. It was warm outside. I was wearing a flannel shirt. The rail should have been warm from the August air. The tap came again. I counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The numbers got into my head and kept going. I watched the water below me and tried to make myself look somewhere else. The far bank was behind me, past the chamber and the upstream rail. I could see the trees if I turned. 4. The tapping sounded closer now. It wasn't louder. It just seemed closer. 5. I remembered Michael standing beside the truck with his hand shaking around the keys. Keep your eyes on the far bank. Don't look at the water. 6. I turned my head toward the trees. The far bank was a dark line under the sky. Branches sat motionless against the stars. There was nothing there except the trees and the pale strip of towpath below them. 7. The pressure to look down got worse. It wasn't a thought exactly, more like the kind of pull you feel when something falls off a roof and you want to see where it landed. 8. I kept my eyes on the far bank. 9. The tapping stopped. For a while I didn't move. The water sat in the chamber, black and flat. Then it started draining again. Not fast, but enough to show the valves were working after all. I checked the far bank once more before looking down. The chamber was empty. Mud covered the bottom. A few weeds lay pressed against the stone, and there was no boat, no body, and no object that could have made the tapping. I shut the drain valves and closed the upstream gate. My hands were shaking by then. Sweat had soaked through my shirt even though the night was warm. I picked up the radio and walked back to the house. The kitchen felt too bright. I left the outside door open and stood there until my breathing settled. Then I sat at the table with the radio in front of me and watched the clock move past 3. I didn't sleep again. At 7:10, I called the state maintenance number. The woman who answered asked for my employee number, then asked what equipment was involved. The downstream bell and the drain valves. Both at the same time? That's what I'm telling you. I could hear keys clicking through the phone. I told her the bell had rung once, the radio hadn't raised any boat traffic, and the chamber had drained slow even with both valves open. She said somebody would need to inspect it in daylight. I can inspect it. Do that first. Check the bell housing and the valve assemblies. If you find damage, call us back. What if I don't? Contact Michael Foster. He knows the old mechanism better than anyone. The bell wasn't visible from there. The trees were brightening over the canal. I've got his address. Then you should call him. The office had treated it like a broken latch or a bad gauge. I wanted that to be enough. A malfunctioning bell and a drain that needed service made more sense than anything else. But the first passage had matched too much of Michael's warning to ignore. I checked the equipment in daylight. The bell clapper moved freely. There was no rust holding it back and no loose piece inside the housing. The drain wheels turned the same as they always had. The channels beneath them were clear. I stood over the empty chamber and looked at the mud. There were no marks in it. By 8:30, I was on Route 167 in my truck. The address from the handoff paperwork sat folded on the passenger seat. I passed the shuttered bait shop first, then the closed canal-side businesses with their faded signs and locked doors. Little Falls had been busier once. You could tell by the number of empty buildings that still had wide front windows and loading doors out back. Grass grew through the cracks along the road. A hand-painted sign hung crooked over a closed diner. The bait shop was a low wood building with a sagging porch. The front windows were covered from the inside, and an old rack of fishing rods stood behind one of them. Michael rented a room above the shop. I parked beside the porch and went up the narrow stairs. The hallway smelled like dust and old cooking oil. 2 doors faced each other at the top. Michael's was on the left. I knocked. Nothing happened. I knocked again. Then I heard the slow scrape of something inside and the soft hiss of an oxygen tube. The door opened a few inches. Michael looked worse than he had at the lock. His face had gone pale and loose around the cheeks, and the tube ran beneath his nose and back over his ears. He kept one hand on the door, while the other held the edge of his jacket closed. "Carter, you knew I'd come." I figured. "What happened?" Bell rang. He stared at me. "One time?" I said. 2:11. I called for a boat and got static. 2:11. I called for a boat and got static. Michael opened the door far enough for me to come in. The room was small, with a bed against one wall and a table under the window. A hot plate sat beside a sink full of dishes. There were 3 oxygen tanks lined up near the closet. He lowered himself into a chair. It took him a while. I stayed standing. "Water came in fine," I said. "No boat below. I opened the drains myself. The chamber took too long to empty." Michael looked at the floor. "How long?" "I don't know. Long enough." "How many?" He raised his eyes. "How many taps?" 9. I watched his hands. They shook against his knees. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the oxygen moving through the tube. "Did you look down?" "No." "Keep your eyes on the far bank?" "Yeah." I pulled the other chair away from the table and sat across from him. "The lock did exactly what you said it would. and I need you to tell me what I was standing over." He reached for the oxygen tube and settled it again, though it hadn't moved. "Listen," he said. "The canal cut through an 1840s work camp. The canal cut through an 1840s work camp." I waited. Diggers, men who cut the channel by hand. They drowned there, and their graves are under the towpath. I looked toward the window. The bait shop roof blocked most of the view, but I could see the tops of the trees along the canal. "How many men?" "Enough." "That's not a number." "No. Lock 9 is a door between the surface and that drowned ground. When the bell calls for an off-schedule cycle, something uses the chamber to come up." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. Michael looked at me as if he was waiting for me to argue. I couldn't find the right place to start. The practical part of my mind kept sorting through the equipment. A bell, a drain, a gate, all things with parts and reasons. "Something," I said. That's what I said. "You expect me to believe there's a door under the lock?" "I expect you to keep your eyes on the far bank." He leaned forward, then stopped to catch his breath. "Keep your eyes on the far bank and it uses you as a door. Look into the water and it gets a face to fix on." I looked down once, 40 years ago, and I've spent every year since making sure it never gets all the way out. "Keep your eyes on the far bank and it uses you as a door. Look into the water and it gets a face to fix on." I looked down once, 40 years ago, and I've spent every year since making sure it never gets all the way out. His voice had gone thin by the end. He looked away from me and toward the window. "How old were you?" 38. "And you saw it?" I looked down. "That's not what I asked." "You asked what I saw. I told you what matters." The glass was dirty around the edges. Outside, a delivery truck passed on the road without slowing. "The taps," I said. "What do they mean?" "What do they mean?" Michael didn't answer right away. "The count marked stages since the presence last escaped." "Escaped from where?" He watched me for a while. "The chamber." "How does it get back in?" "It does." Just that. I looked at the oxygen tanks, the old bed, the dishes in the sink. He'd spent 15 years living in rooms like this one, and listening for a bell beside a lock nobody used anymore. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did." "You told me not to look at the water." "You didn't ask the right question." "I asked what happens if I look." "And you kept your eyes up." "I didn't know what I was doing." That helped. My shirt was still damp from the night. I could smell sweat and canal mud on myself. "What happens at 11? 11 means it has chosen the tender to take down with it. I stayed alive by answering only the bell between 2 and 3 and never letting that count finish. The mud. The last tap hanging there while I watched the trees. Only the bell between 2 and 3? That's the one that calls. What about the other hours? There aren't other hours." Then he looked down. I didn't push him on that. Not yet. "How many tenders before me?" "Enough." "Michael." I could have kept asking. He'd answer some of it and leave the rest sitting between us. That was how he worked. He gave you the part he believed might keep you alive. I looked at the table instead. A dented tin box sat beside the sink. It was gray under the old paint, with a rusted latch and a shallow dent across the lid. Michael followed my eyes. "Take it back to the lock," he said. "That money is safer there than it is with either one of us." He reached for the box. His arm shook badly enough that I stood and took it before he could lift it. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the table and opened the latch. Inside were envelopes, state payment slips, and stacks of old bills held together with rubber bands that had gone dark and brittle. Some of the envelopes had dates written across them in pencil. The first ones were so old the paper had yellowed at the edges. "How long have you kept this?" "Since I started." "Why?" "Because it belongs to the lock." "Michael, it's money, not mine." "You saved every off-schedule payment?" "Most of them." "How much is in here?" "Don't count it." "Why not?" "Because you might decide it's worth something." It pulled at my arm. Michael watched me with the same pale, steady look he'd had when he signed my paperwork. "You're still going back," he said. "I've got a job." That's not what I asked. I didn't want to go back. I wanted the bell fixed. I wanted a state mechanic to replace it and tell me the drain valves had been sticking. I wanted Michael to say the whole thing had been an old man superstition and that I'd been awake too long. None of that had happened. "I need the money," I said. "For what?" "Molly's tuition." Michael nodded like he'd expected that answer. He knew about Molly through the things I'd said during the handoff, though I hadn't told him much. I sent the payments to her school because it was the one part of my life I could still handle without asking her to come closer. "Then take it," he said. "But don't let the count finish." "I won't." "Keep your eyes on the far bank." "I know." "Don't look down." "I heard you." "But don't let the count finish." "I won't." "Keep your eyes on the far bank." "I know." "Don't look down." "I heard you." He reached for the oxygen tube again. "Listen, Carter. If it rings, you answer it. You fill the chamber. You let it drain. You count. To 9. To 9. And if it rings again tomorrow? It won't be tomorrow." "How do you know?" "I know the lock." I carried the tin box down the stairs and put it on the passenger seat. The metal made a hard sound against the vinyl when I set it down. Michael came to the top of the stairs but didn't follow me outside. I started the truck and pulled away from the bait shop. Route 167 ran straight toward the canal, past the same closed businesses and dark windows I'd passed on the way in. The tin box stayed beside me, with the old envelopes shifting inside it as the truck went over the rough spots. I kept one hand on the wheel and watched the road ahead. I was going back to Lock 9. I was going to keep taking the stipend until I understood how to stop the bell. The tuition payments were the last practical connection I had to Molly, and I wasn't ready to give those up. I drove back toward Lock 9 with Michael Foster's dented tin box on the passenger seat. I got back to Lock 9 before noon. The tin box stayed on the passenger seat while I checked the bell housing, the drain wheels, and the gate chains. Everything worked the way it was supposed to. The bell clapper moved freely. The valves opened all the way. There was no loose metal or rust buildup. I spent the daylight hours going over the ordinary machinery because ordinary machinery was what I understood. I took the guard plate off and checked the shaft. I greased the fittings again. I ran the upstream gate through half a cycle and watched the water level change on the gauges. The lock did exactly what a lock was supposed to do. By evening, I had put the tin box in the desk drawer and made a full entry in the ledger. I wrote down the time of the last cycle, the condition of the bell, and the fact that no vessel had been waiting below the downstream gate. Then I crossed it all out and started over. At 2:11 in the morning, the bell rang. I was already in the crank house. I'd been sitting on the stool beside the radio with my coat on and the flashlight between my boots. When the sound came through the open door, I stood up and waited. No second ring came. I took the radio from the rail and called for a boat below the lock. Static answered me. I tried again, then put the radio down and went to the crank. I knew what the bell meant. I filled the chamber first. The handle turned hard, then moved more easily once the gate shifted inside the wall. Water came through the opening and spread across the stone bottom. I watched it rise until the level matched the gauge, then crossed to the downstream side and opened the drain valves. The water rushed beneath the gate. The sound filled the chamber and came back off the walls. I kept my eyes on the far bank. The first tap came from below the downstream gate. I counted without looking down. 1, 2, 3. The taps came slow and even. There was no boat outside, no current against the gate. Nothing I could hear except the water draining and that steady knock from beneath me. 4, 5, 6. The far bank was a dark line under the sky. The trees stood still above the towpath. I fixed my eyes on one crooked branch and kept them there. 7, 8, 9. The tapping stopped. It stayed stopped while the last of the water ran through the channels. My neck muscles pulled tight. I didn't turn until the chamber was empty. Mud, weeds, stone. Nothing else? I shut the valves and closed the gate. Then I walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with the radio in front of me. The clock moved past 3. I didn't sleep. The next day was quiet. The refrigerator kicked on. A truck passed somewhere beyond the trees. The radio gave a burst of static around noon and then went dead again. I checked the equipment twice. That night I went down to the chamber before 2. I brought the flashlight, but I kept it pointed at the floor. The beam picked out the rust on the rail and the wet shine along the stone. I didn't need to see anything else. At 2:11, the bell rang once. I filled the chamber and opened the drains. The machinery made the same sounds as before. The water came in. The water went out. There was no reason for it to feel different, but I was waiting for the tapping. It started after the level had dropped a few inches. 1, 2, 3. I watched the far bank. 4, 5, 6. The branch I'd picked the night before was still there, black against the sky. A moth moved through the edge of the flashlight beam and disappeared. 7, 8, 9. The tapping stopped. I waited for the chamber to drain. The water moved slowly at first, then faster. I could hear the valves working under the gate. After a long pause, the tapping started again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even different from the first tapping. But it didn't belong to the machinery, and it didn't follow the pattern I'd heard the night before. The sound came 3 times, then stopped. A few seconds passed. It came twice more. I stood with my hands on the rail. The thing under the water wasn't failing. It was answering me. I shut the valves when the chamber emptied and went back to the house. The tin box was still in the desk drawer. I took it out and set it on the table, then stood there looking at the dented lid. Michael had said it belonged to the lock. He'd saved every payment because he believed the money was part of the obligation, not wages. Not really. More like a receipt for staying alive. I put the box back in the drawer. The third night was worse. I got to the chamber early and stayed near the downstream rail. The air had turned cold after dark. My hands were stiff inside my gloves, and the metal under them held the damp from the canal. At 2:11, the bell rang. I didn't call for a boat this time. I took the radio anyway and set it on the rail. Then I opened the upstream gate. The water entered the chamber. I watched the level rise until it reached the mark and crossed to the drain wheels. The first one squealed. The second one turned with a low grinding sound. I kept my eyes on the far bank. The tapping started before the water had dropped halfway. 1, 2, 3, 4. I held onto the rail. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. The sound stopped. I waited. 10. The tap came from below me. One hard strike against the inside of the gate. I nearly turned. My head moved. I grabbed the rail with both hands and kept my eyes on the trees. The far bank blurred in front of me. I could see the towpath, the low weeds along its edge, and the black shape of the branch. The tapping didn't come again. The chamber drained slowly. I stayed where I was until the water fell below the gate, and the last of it ran out through the channels. My arms hurt from gripping the rail. Then I closed the valves. I didn't look down until I was back in the crank house. The flashlight stayed in my hand, but I didn't turn it toward the chamber. I couldn't learn anything from mud and empty stone. Michael had said the count would reach 11 eventually. Now it was at 10. At dawn, I called Molly. The phone rang several times before she answered. Her voice was thick with sleep and already irritated. "Hey, Dad? Hey, you near any water last night?" There was a pause. "What? Any water? A river? A lake? Did you call the towpath line?" "No, Dad. You woke me up for that?" "Just answer the question." I did. "No." I sat at the kitchen table with the lock radio beside me. The tin box was on the floor by my boot. I could see the top edge of it under the table. "All right. Is something wrong?" "No, Dad." I said all right. I could hear a bed creak on her end, and then some movement that sounded like she was sitting up. "Are you sick?" "No." "Are you in trouble?" Daylight had started over the canal. The window showed the first gray strip above the trees. "I've got work to finish." "At 6 in the morning." "It's the job." "You sound weird," she said. "I didn't sleep much." "That doesn't answer anything." "No." "Do you need me to call somebody?" "No." "Then what do you need?" I needed the count to stop. I needed Michael to be alive and sitting across from me in that rented room, telling me I had misunderstood the whole thing. I needed the lock to be a lock again. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing." "Go back to sleep." "Yeah." "Okay." Her annoyance made sense. Around 8:15, the funeral home called. The woman on the phone said she was calling about Michael. She told me he died in his room sometime before dawn. The oxygen company had found him when they came to check the tanks. I asked what she needed from me. She said Michael had listed me as the person responsible for identifying his belongings. There weren't many of them. A jacket, a wallet, some papers. The tin box wasn't in the room. I looked at the box on the floor. Where do I go? I wrote it down on the back of the payment ledger, then put the phone down. I closed lock 9 for the morning. That was the first time I'd done it since taking the job. I chained the crank house door and left the radio inside. The bell was visible through the window, black against the brightening canal. I didn't trust it to ring while I was gone. I didn't trust it not to. The drive into Little Falls took less than half an hour. The town looked different in daylight than it had the day before. Storefronts opened along the main street. A man swept the sidewalk outside a hardware store. Cars moved through the intersection near the courthouse. The funeral home sat in a brick building with narrow windows and a covered entrance. Inside, everything smelled like floor wax and flowers. The woman who met me at the desk asked me to confirm my name, then brought out a cardboard box with Michael's things in it. His jacket was folded on top. The canvas had gone soft at the elbows. Under it were a wallet, a pocket knife, a state identification card, and a handful of receipts. There was no family photograph, no address book. She asked me to identify the jacket and wallet. I did. Then she led me past a hallway where framed memorial cards hung in rows. At the end was a small room with a glass case and a plaque mounted on the wall. The plaque had been moved from the canal office years ago, she said. It listed the workers who died during the original construction. The date at the top read 1840-something. The rest of the lettering had been worn smooth in places, but the names were still clear. Below the list was another section. Descendants. Families connected to the men buried beneath the towpath. Michael's legal surname was there. It wasn't Foster. The name on the plaque matched the old record in a folder beneath the glass. Michael had taken the name Foster after he left the canal. The record showed that he'd been born into one of the families listed below the drowned workers. I read the page twice. The lock had been passed down through it, along with the money and the warnings, and the job nobody wanted to explain. He hadn't just been a tender. He'd been the next person in a line of people who kept the doors shut. And now he was dead. The woman waited near the doorway while I put the papers back in the folder. She didn't ask whether I knew about any of it. I took Michael's jacket and the wallet. She said the rest could be held until somebody from the family came forward. There wasn't anybody else. I carried the box out to the truck and set it on the passenger seat. The jacket went on top. Then I drove back toward Lock 9 with the old surname still in my head. Michael's death had left the presence without its tender. I stopped at the house long enough to take the tin box from the drawer. The ledgers stayed where they were. I didn't need them. I put the box on the passenger seat beside Michael's jacket and drove down to the lock. The afternoon passed without a bell. I checked the water levels. I opened and closed the gates. I walked the towpath and kept my eyes off the chamber whenever I could. The memorial plaque kept coming back to me. The old name under the glass. The list of men who'd gone into the canal and never come out. By evening, I understood what Michael had meant when he said the money belonged to the lock. It had been paying for the person who stayed. I called Molly after dark. She answered on the third ring. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, what's going on?" "I might be out of range tonight, but I'm trying to finish this job right before I walk away. I'll call you in the morning." "Are you sick?" "No." "Are you in trouble?" The bell was too far away to see clearly. The tin box sat on the table with Michael's jacket folded beside it. "I've got to handle something here." "Dad." "I'll call you in the morning." "You said that already." "I know." "Then answer me." I couldn't tell her about the count or the drowned workers. None of those words belonged in a call with my daughter. "I'll call you in the morning." She was quiet again. "Okay." I ended the call and left the phone on the table beside me. The next 14 days went by without another bell. I kept Michael's tin box in the desk drawer and the pry bar beside the crank house door. I checked the lock in daylight, then checked it again after dark. The gates worked. The drains worked. Nothing came through. Molly called once on the second evening. She asked if I was all right, and I told her I was. She asked if I was still at the lock. I said yes. I didn't tell her about Michael's death or the plaque or the count sitting at 10. She already had enough to worry about. Before we hung up, I told her I'd get through the night and call her in the morning. That was the promise. By 2:11, I was standing beside the upstream crank with my coat on and the pry bar under one arm. The tin box sat on the rail near the radio. I had put my own off-schedule payments in it before dark, stacked with the bills Michael had saved. They made the box heavier than it had been when I carried it from his room. The bell rang. It wasn't the flat clang I'd heard before. The sound pulled hard through the housing and shook the metal around it. The clapper struck once, then dragged against the inside of the bell as if something had hold of it. The radio filled with static. I picked it up and pressed the button. Lock 9 to any vessel below the downstream gate. Come back." The static got louder. There was a crackle underneath it, then a low burst of noise that might have been a voice if I hadn't known better. I set the radio down and took hold of the crank. The handle fought me before I'd turned it a full rotation. The shaft groaned inside the wall. Water began pushing through the upstream gate before the gate was open, leaking around the edges in black streams. "All right," I muttered. "Gear's not seated." I put both hands on the handle and leaned into it. The metal shifted another inch. Water came faster. I kept turning until the gate lifted enough for the chamber to take it. The level started rising. I watched the water spread over the stone floor, carrying bits of weed and bark toward the downstream end. The bell pulled again behind me. The crank jumped under my hands. Michael was dead. There wasn't anybody left at the old mechanism who knew how to answer it. That was what kept getting past the other facts. A bell could be old. A drain could stick. But Michael had been the one who knew what to do. And now the lock had started calling for him. Or for somebody else. When the gauge reached the mark, I crossed to the downstream rail. I left the radio where it was and picked up the pry bar and tin box. The bar was cold through my glove. The box knocked against my leg as I carried it. I set both on the stone beside the rail. The water was already draining. Not much. A thin current moved beneath the gate and disappeared into the channels. But the chamber level barely changed. I opened the first wheel. It squealed and turned hard. The second one gave a little easier, then stopped short. I went back and tried it again. Nothing. The water kept its dark surface below me. I could see the reflection of the crank house light trembling along the top, though there wasn't enough movement to break it apart. Then the tapping started. It came fast this time. Not one strike followed by another. A run of hard taps against the inside of the gate. 1, 2, 3, 4. I took the pry bar from the stone and held it against the rail. The tin box stayed beside my boot. 5, 6, 7. The sound came from below the waterline. It was urgent now, quick enough that the separate taps almost ran together. 8, 9, 10. I fixed my eyes on the far bank. The trees stood above the towpath in one dark line. A crooked branch reached out over the water, the same one I'd watched the night before. I kept my eyes on that branch and tried to let the rest of the lock become machinery again. The tapping stopped at 10. The silence was worse than the sound. Water moved under the gate. The radio hissed behind me. Somewhere in the trees, a night bird made one short call and went quiet. I didn't look down. The pressure built anyway. It sat behind my eyes and pulled at my neck. The chamber was right there. I could turn my head and see what had been making the noise. I could finish the count. 11 was only another number. Michael had said it would choose the tender at 11. He'd also said looking down gave it a face. I kept watching the branch. A normal cycle would close the gate and let the chamber empty. That was what the lock was built to do. It was also what the thing wanted. Open water, a clear passage. One more cycle and the door would be waiting. So I took the pry bar to the crank. The handle had started turning back under the pressure of the gate. I jammed the narrow end of the bar through the spokes and braced the other end against the housing. The metal struck with a hard clang. The crank pulled against it. I held on. Come on! The bar bent a little in my hands. The gears inside the housing turned with a grinding sound, and the water under the gate rushed faster for a second. I shoved the bar down and forced the mechanism against itself. The cold came through my gloves. It wasn't the ordinary cold of wet metal before dawn. It went straight into my fingers and numbed the joints. My hands stopped feeling like hands. The pry bar slipped, and I caught it before it hit the stone. The crank moved another inch. I drove the bar back into the spokes. The tapping stayed at 10. "Not one more inch," I said. I put my shoulder against the bar and pushed. The housing shook. Something inside the wall gave a deep, metallic crack. The crank spun half a turn, then stopped hard enough to throw me against the rail. The gate seized. Water still moved beneath it, but the wheel wasn't turning anymore. The drain remained open just enough to let some of the chamber empty. It left about a foot of black water across the bottom. That was enough. My hands were stiff and white inside the gloves. I pulled them off with my teeth and flexed my fingers. The skin looked normal, but I couldn't feel the tips. The tin box sat where I'd left it. I carried it to the rail and opened the latch. Michael's bills were inside the envelopes, folded and stacked in the order he'd kept them. State payment slips, old rubber bands, money he'd never spent. My money was there too. The payments I'd saved after sending the first ones to Molly. I had meant to use them for her tuition, a book, a fee, whatever came next. The state called it an off-schedule stipend. Michael had called it money that belonged to the lock. He'd been right. It wasn't pay for running a gate. It was payment for staying there and refusing to acknowledge the men under the towpath. Payment for watching the far bank while something below counted its way toward a new door. I took the first stack of bills from the box. The tapping struck 3 times below me and stopped. I kept my eyes on the trees and threw the money over the rail. The bills scattered when they hit the water. Some landed flat, others folded in half and dropped out of sight. A few stayed on the surface, sliding slowly toward the gate. I reached into the box again. The old money went next. Then the envelopes. Then my own payments, all the bills I'd held on to because Molly needed them, and because I thought surviving this job had to be worth something. They spread across the black water in a loose layer. The tapping started again. 1, 2, 3, 4. I kept my eyes on the far bank. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It stopped there. The pressure behind my eyes got worse. My head wanted to turn. The water was close enough that I could hear the bills touching one another as the slow current moved them. I thought about Molly asleep somewhere far from the canal. I thought about the way she'd asked if I was in trouble and how quickly I'd told her no. I wasn't going to give the lock another answer. The pry bar held the crank in place. The drain didn't close, but it didn't open any farther either. Water stayed trapped in the chamber, black beneath the rail, and the money drifted across it without sinking all at once. I waited. The bell didn't ring again. The tapping stayed at 10, then faded until I couldn't tell whether I was hearing it or the water under the gate. I watched the far bank and counted the crooked branch, the pale strip of towpath, and the dark spaces between the trees. Nothing moved there. The water kept shifting for a while. Then it slowed. The water in Lock 9 stopped moving while I kept my eyes fixed on the far bank. By the time the sun came up, the water had stopped moving completely. A foot of it sat behind the gate, black under the gray morning light. The bills I'd thrown in during the night had soaked through and spread across the surface. Some were caught against the stone. Others drifted in a slow circle near the gate. I walked the upper walkway and checked the drain wheels again. The first one was still open. The second one was jammed halfway through its turn. I put both hands on it and leaned until my shoulders hurt. Nothing happened. The gate had seized with water behind it. The mechanism wasn't going to drain the chamber, and it wasn't going to cycle again. I went back to the tender's house and made coffee. I didn't drink it. The pot sat on the burner while I filled out the state report at the kitchen table. The form wanted equipment numbers, times, weather conditions, and a description of the failure. I wrote that the downstream gate had seized during an off-schedule cycle and that the drain assemblies were no longer serviceable. Under recommended action, I wrote, "Lock inoperable, structural failure." It was close enough to the truth for the state. The lock was inoperable. I wasn't going to write about the tapping or the count or what had been waiting under the water. Nobody at the state office would know what to do with that, and I didn't need another person telling me to contact Michael. I signed the bottom of the page and put it in the outgoing folder. Then I called the maintenance number. The woman who answered asked for my employee number. I gave it to her and told her the downstream gate had failed. "Can you still work the lock manually?" "No." "Is the chamber drained?" "No." "Any visible damage?" "The gate's seized. Drain valves are shot." I could hear the keys through the phone. "Can you secure the site?" "Yeah." "Do that first. We'll send an inspector." "How long?" "Can't say." "All right." I wrote it on the form, then hung up. The welder was in the equipment shed behind the house. It was an old gas unit with a cracked gauge and a hose that had been patched near the handle. I carried it down to the drain valves and set it on the walkway. The morning had warmed a little, but the metal was still cold under my gloves. I shut the first valve as far as it would go and welded the wheel to the housing. The flame made a blue cone against the steel. Water hissed somewhere beneath the gate. I worked around the joint until the metal ran together and the wheel couldn't turn. The second valve took longer. It had stopped halfway open, and I had to weld the spokes in place before I could reach the housing. When I finished, both wheels were fixed solid. I stood there with the torch lowered and watched the black water. Nothing moved on the surface except the bills. They had gone pale where the ink had run. One stuck to the stone near my boot, held there by a wet corner. I left it. The crank handle came off with a wrench. The nut was tight, but it gave after I put a length of pipe over the wrench for more leverage. I carried the handle back to the house and put it beside the report folder. Without it, the crank shaft was just a metal stub inside the housing. The lock could still fail in 100 ordinary ways. A gate could rust, a gauge could crack, a valve could stick. It couldn't be cycled. I went back inside and opened the ledger. The off-schedule line had $40 credited to it from the last passage. I drew a line through the entry and wrote the date beside it. Then I checked the next page. There was nothing there. I turned another page. Nothing. The state ledger had stopped adding the payment. I checked the older entries, though I already knew what I'd find. The money ended at the night the gate seized. No more $40 credits. No more unexplained deposits that I could send to Molly's school. Tuition didn't get cheaper because I'd found out what the stipend meant. I closed the ledger and put it in the desk drawer. The next day passed slowly. An inspector didn't come. Nobody called back. I checked the welded valves in the morning and again before dark. The welds held. The water stayed black and still. I kept the promise I'd made to Molly and waited until morning to call. Day 49 started with rain against the kitchen window. It wasn't heavy. Just a steady tapping that ran along the glass and filled the spaces between other sounds. I sat at the table with the phone in my hand. The number was already on the screen. Molly answered after a few rings. "Hey, Dad." "Hey. Something wrong?" "No." "Then why you calling this early?" Rain blurred the canal and the trees beyond it. I said I'd call. "You did." "Made some changes at work." "What kind?" "Lock's closed." "Closed how?" "Permanent." I had planned to explain it better. I could have told her the state report had gone in. I could have told her the valves were welded shut and the crank was sitting on the table beside me. I could have told her there wouldn't be any more money from the lock. Instead, I said, "The extra payments are done? Okay. I'll still send what I can." "You don't have to." "I know." "Dad." There was something in the way she said it that made me stop trying to turn the call into a work report. I looked down at my hand. The skin around my fingers was cracked from the cold metal and the welding gloves. A black line ran across one knuckle. "I love you," I said. "You don't have to say anything back, and you don't have to fix anything. I just needed you to know." I could hear something in the background on her end. A door closing, water running maybe. She didn't hang up. Then she said, "Okay, Dad. I know." That was all she gave me. We stayed on the phone for a while without talking much. She asked if the lock was safe, and I told her it was. I asked if she'd eaten, and she said she had. She asked whether I was going to find another job. Not yet. You can't stay there forever. I know. You need to figure out what you're doing. I am. Then she told me she had class and needed to go. All right. Call me tomorrow. I will. Actually call? Yeah. I kept the phone against my ear for another second before setting it on the table. The rain was still tapping at the window. It sounded ordinary. The state inspector came by in the afternoon. He walked the upper path with a clipboard and looked at the seized gate from both sides. I showed him the welded valves and the report I'd filed. He asked why I'd removed the crank handle. Safety. That'll do. He wrote something down. Then he told me the lock would be taken off the active schedule and listed as decommissioned. The tender's house would stay available for a caretaker until the state decided what to do with the property. Am I still working here? If you want to be. Doing what? Checking the site, reporting vandalism, keeping an eye on things. There's not much to check. That's usually how it goes after decommissioning. I signed it and handed it back. After he left, I walked down to the gate. The rain had stopped. The water inside the chamber was still there, dark beneath the walkway. The bills had disappeared from the surface. They were probably caught against the drain channels or resting on the mud below. I didn't look for them. I stayed on as caretaker. There were other jobs in other places, but I didn't ask about them. The house was paid through the position, and the lock needed somebody nearby, whether the state admitted that or not. The bell never rang again. 14 days went by. I checked the empty schedule in the ledger each morning, then stopped opening it. The $40 line stayed blank. On day 60, I was at the downstream gate at 2:11 in the morning. The night was windless. The trees along the far bank stood in one dark row, and the towpath was a pale strip beneath them. The crank house light reached across the walkway but stopped short of the chamber. The sealed valves held. The pry bar was still wedged through the crank spokes. I hadn't moved it since the night I'd forced the mechanism shut. For a while, there was only the sound of water somewhere under the stone. Then something tapped against the inside of the gate. I kept my hands on the rail. The tap came again. One. Another followed after a long pause. Then another. The count moved slowly through the black water beneath me, each strike separate enough that I could hear the silence around it. 4, 5, 6. The gate didn't move. The bell stayed quiet. 7, 8, 9. I watched the crooked branch above the far bank. It hadn't changed since the first night. It reached over the trees at the same angle, thin and dark against the sky. 10. The tapping stopped. I waited for 11. It didn't come. The water stayed behind the sealed gate. The bills were gone below the surface, and the lock had no way to open. I kept my eyes on the far bank and never looked into the sealed lockwater.